I always thought Austin was the kind of place where people got to start over. The city feels like a tech ecosystem growing faster than its own shadow, full of young, hungry minds who believe they can change the world with an idea scribbled on a napkin. I am not like them. I work quietly, steadily. I do not chase flashy promises or rainbow colored pitch decks. I believe in one thing and one thing only, that a system is only safe when the person who built it understands every direction danger can come from. Maybe that belief began the night my old company suffered a data breach. I watched a team of engineers sit in the middle of the office, completely defeated, the flickering lights reflecting off faces stretched thin with panic. We lost hundreds of thousands of user records because of one tiny vulnerability. Nobody bothered to check. I looked at that chaos and swore that if I ever built another system, I would never let it collapse that easily again. 8 years later, I was standing inside the wide auditorium of NovaForge Labs, the company I had poured almost my entire career into. My name is Ava Morgan, 34, lead security engineer. Not the kind of role people brag about, but the kind every serious tech company needs. I was not the most important person in the building, but I was the one their systems quietly depended on. It was an all-hands meeting that day. I expected nothing more than the usual empty speeches. But Beckham Rhodes had just become our new chief executive officer, and everything started drifting off its normal axis. Beckham is the kind of person you can spot from across a conference hall because he practically glows. Deep blue blazer, expensive shoes, a walk like he was born to stand on a stage. He talked fast, talked a lot, and always sounded like he had memorized a leadership book written by someone who had never led anything. He never understood my work, and he never cared to. Beckham stepped onto the stage, the spotlight catching that overconfident smile of his. None of us knew what was coming, not even me. He started talking about innovation, about growth, about how Nova Forge needed a bold transformation. I stood in the third row, arms crossed, listening with the patience I had learned over years of dealing with people who like to perform more than they like to think. Then his tone shifted, lower, rehearsed, like he was preparing to deliver something big. Ava Morgan. My stomach tightened when I heard my name echo across the room. He did not look at me. He stared straight ahead, wearing that thin, victorious smile. Something was off. Beckham went on, saying the company needed people who thought big, who embraced the future, who were ready to change. And then he ended with a single line. I was not one of them. He fired me right there, in front of the entire company. No warning, no conversation, no chance to respond. There was a long, crushing moment when the whole auditorium went silent. I heard someone inhale, sharply. Another person dropped a pen. Beckham kept talking, about removing old weights, about shedding anything that slowed NovaForge down. His tone reminded me of every engineer who ever blamed security because I made them spend 5 extra minutes verifying information. I did not speak. I did not flinch. I stood tall, kept my face calm, because the only way not to be humiliated is to refuse to let anyone see you bleed. I packed my things in silence. Some coworkers glanced at me with guilt and confusion. Others avoided my eyes as if my shame was contagious. At the back of the room, I saw Jordan Ellery, our chief operating officer. Jordan was not impressed. Her gaze was sharp, assessing Beckham's stupidity, like someone calculating the magnitude of a disaster. She knew when to intervene and when to stand back. Today, she chose the latter. I gave her a small nod before walking out. I left the auditorium, my footsteps echoing through the long hallway toward the main doors. Everything was so quiet I could hear my own breath. I reached into my bag for my car keys, and my hand brushed against a small silver flash drive. Old, scratched, nothing special to anyone else. But to me, it held the first rough draft of Sentinel-9, the system I had spent years building and defending. I did not carry it because I expected this day. I carried it because I never fully trusted any internal storage, especially under a chief executive like Beckham, who was obsessed with controlling everything. I held the drive for a moment, then stepped outside. I did not know what would happen next. I only knew one thing. Beckham thought he had just won, but he had no idea he had just pulled out the foundation stone of Nova Forge with his own hands. My story did not start the day I got fired. That was only the trigger. And if you have followed me this far, you probably understand that strange mix of helplessness and calm I carried with me as I walked out of that building. The story is far from over, and a lot of people will be shocked by what happens next. If you are listening from anywhere out there, let me know. And if quiet intelligence is the kind of thing that intrigues you, do not forget to hit subscribe so you will not miss what comes next. That night after leaving Nova Forge, I thought I would feel lighter, but the feeling never came. I sat in my quiet living room, the glow of the screen reflecting off the silver flash drive resting beside my hand. Sentinel-9 always pulled my thoughts back whenever I looked at it, like a reminder that I had built it not just with knowledge, but with the kind of obsession that grows out of old wounds. At my former company, a piece of code I wrote had once been stolen and used as the backbone of a major project. I spent months fighting to reclaim ownership, and from that point on, I never worked without protection. When I joined Nova Forge, I started building again from scratch. Sentinel-9 began as a small toolkit for automating access control, then slowly grew into the company's adaptive security system. It was designed to analyze behavior, rewrite its own defense rules, and lock down any suspicious activity. Most importantly, I built in an intellectual property mechanism. If anyone accessed the source code without being on the verified list, the system would automatically activate a protection mode and send a report to the owner of the token. I registered that token under my name, not to claim power, but because I knew the company's leadership was often too hurried to care about long-term risks. Beckham never understood that. He always wanted to turn Sentinel-9 into a showpiece for the upcoming tech conference. He wanted to parade it around as some special asset he could use to charm investors. Once, in a meeting, I explained that the system had not gone through final validation, and showing it too early could lead to misunderstandings or errors. He only laughed and asked why I was always so pessimistic. That was when I realized he only wanted a prop to support his image. After the day he fired me, I knew he would not stop. He had already planned to use Sentinel-9 to impress people, and now there was no one left to stand in his way. I could almost picture him calling Nolan Hayes into his office. Nolan was the youngest engineer on my team, bright and eager to learn, but nowhere near experienced enough to handle a system like this. If Beckham pushed him, Nolan would have no choice but to access the source repository without any safety net. My phone buzzed while I was thinking about that. When I looked at the screen, I saw the alert from Sentinel-9. Unusual access detected. Protection mode level 1 activated. I was not surprised. I knew it would happen the moment they opened my code files. Level 1 was only a soft warning, but it was enough to lock certain permissions and restrict the engineer's access. I had barely put the phone down when another alert arrived. Protection mode level 2 activated. That meant they had not only opened the code, but tried to run it. Maybe they had pushed the near-final build onto the internal servers to prepare for the conference. Or maybe they were attempting to alter the access structure to bypass the authentication layers I had configured. Whichever the case, Sentinel-9 flagged it as misuse. I knew Jordan would notice immediately. She had once asked me in detail about the intellectual property mechanism when the company started scaling. Jordan was not like Beckham. She understood the consequences of mishandling a security system, but Jordan did not have the authority to stop his plans. She was practical, the kind of leader who only intervened once the damage was undeniable. I thought that would be the end of it, but the third alert made me sit up straight. Sentinel-9 had sealed the access logs and limited the administrator's control. That only happened when the system determined that someone was attempting to cross a boundary it would not allow. I knew the engineers would never do that on their own. Only Beckham would be reckless enough to force them into it. I stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. The lights of Austin stretched all the way to the horizon. I wondered what they were doing inside Nova Forge at that moment. Maybe Nolan was trying to calm everyone down, or maybe Beckham was yelling in frustration, unable to understand why a system he thought he now owned was suddenly pushing back. They believed they were simply opening a piece of code, when in reality they had stepped into a zone designed to protect itself from impulsive hands. I knew exactly how Sentinel-9 worked, knew its limits, and knew what would happen if they took one more wrong step. They thought I was gone for good, but the system was not. Sentinel-9 was still performing the job it was built to do. And that meant a much larger chain of events was about to unfold. I did not need to return to Nova Forge to know that. All I had to do was watch the alerts appearing one after another, and I understood they had just triggered a process none of them were capable of controlling. The next morning, I woke with the feeling that something inside Nova Forge was about to crack wide open. Not because I still cared about that company, but because Sentinel-9 had a very consistent rhythm. When it sent alerts during the night, it usually took only a few hours for consequences to spread. I made myself a cup of coffee and opened my laptop, not to monitor the situation, but to prepare for my interview at Titan Systems. I wanted a fresh start, and today could be the first step. While I was reviewing my documents, my phone began ringing nonstop. I saw the name of an old coworker. I did not answer, but the messages appeared immediately after. The entire marketing department had been locked out. Their advertising campaign systems would not load, and the customer tracking dashboard returned nothing but a blank page. By the time I read the second message, things had grown even worse. The operations team reported that almost all back-end application interfaces had switched into read-only mode. That paralyzed every write function, meaning they could not update, modify, or execute any changes across the platform. I understood exactly why it was happening. Sentinel-9 was never designed to create chaos, but to protect. When the system detected abnormal access, it automatically reduced permissions for every department outside the safe administrator list. Switching to read-only mode was its way of preventing dangerous actions before an intruder could damage data. But to a company that lived on data like Nova Forge, it was the same as unplugging the power during peak hours. I could picture the scene in the office as people tried to open their systems only to be met with restricted access warnings. Beckham would never accept that his own decision had caused it. And sure enough, a few minutes later, I received another message from someone in the engineering team. Beckham had erupted during an emergency meeting, slamming his hand on the table and declaring that the engineers had allowed a catastrophic failure. He demanded they restore full access within an hour, as if it were nothing more than flipping a switch. But the engineers had finally lost their patience. They pushed back. One of the senior engineers said outright that Sentinel-9 was functioning exactly as designed, and if they kept interfering outside protocol, things would become much worse. They made it clear that deploying my code without legitimate authorization had triggered the protection mechanism. This was not a technical bug, nor was it a trap I had set. It was the lawful response of an intellectual property protected system. I knew Nolan must have been in that meeting. He was always the one caught in the middle, understanding the architecture of Sentinel-9, but also absorbing Beckham's pressure. Around midday, I received a message from Nolan. Just a short line. I am sorry. I understood what he felt. Nolan knew I had never written malware or backdoors into the system. He knew every safeguard in place existed to protect the intellectual asset under proper law, and that made his position even harder as Beckham pushed him. While Nova Forge descended into chaos, I tried to keep my mind steady for the interview. Titan Systems was a major corporation specializing in security infrastructure. I had lost 8 years to a company that never valued my work, and now I wanted something different. I walked into Titan Systems with a calm I had not felt in a long time. The interview went smoothly. They asked detailed questions about adaptive security models, and I answered naturally, not to prove anything, but because it was the field I understood best. When I stepped out of Titan Systems, my phone buzzed again. This time it was not messages, but a string of emails from former coworkers. The system had been crippled for more than 6 hours. Clients were beginning to complain. Some wanted their data returned, others warned they would switch providers if the issue continued. A company that depends on data depends on trust, and once trust is gone, it rarely returns. Jordan also sent me a message, not to ask for help or beg me to come back, but simply to confirm that she understood exactly what was happening. Jordan had demanded that Beckham stop all interference and wait for the legal team to review the situation. But Beckham remained defiant. During the afternoon meeting, he announced that he needed to prove to the entire company that he was still in control. He refused to accept that a system I built could place limits on his ambition. I read that message while walking into the parking lot. The Austin sky in the late afternoon was a deep orange, sunlight spilling across rooftops like a painting. Beneath that peaceful scene, I knew Nova Forge was buried inside a storm. They still believed they could fix everything through sheer willpower. But Sentinel-9 did not respond to anyone's emotions. It only followed the logic I had written. A company that ignores technical boundaries will always pay for it eventually. And that day was only the beginning of a collapse they would have no power to control. I thought things would calm down after Sentinel-9 locked itself at protection level 2, but by the next morning, I realized I had underestimated Beckham's recklessness. When I woke, my personal inbox had 4 new alerts from the system. These were not ordinary alerts. Every line referenced a chain of unusual requests trying to reach the resource core that only Sentinel-9 was allowed to control. This was no longer the careless access of an inexperienced engineer. The query patterns had the structure of a deliberate attack. Nova Forge had begun trying to break the code. I knew Beckham would never stop because his pride mattered more to him than anything else. But I did not expect him to hire a team of gray hat hackers. Those test commands bore the marks of advanced privilege scanning tools, the kind an internal engineer would never dare use unless ordered directly by an executive. As I read through the logs, I could almost picture him standing behind the technical team, restless and anxious, like a gambler losing hand after hand. I did not want to think about Nolan, but I knew he was trapped in the middle of the storm. Nolan understood Sentinel-9 better than anyone left at Nova Forge, and he was certainly being pressured by Beckham about the system's layered structure. Nolan was not a traitor, but he was too young to resist orders from an irritable chief executive. A part of me hoped he was at least strong enough to warn them about the consequences, but I also understood the feeling of being caught between loyalty and fear. From what I saw in the logs, the hackers had tried to create a simulated environment to trick Sentinel-9 into ignoring the intellectual property authentication. They wanted to make it believe the permission change was legitimate, but the system was not that easy to fool. Sentinel-9 did not only inspect code, it monitored the context. No matter how similar the simulated environment was, the system detected mismatches between real data and the artificial model. Just hours after I was fired, Sentinel-9 began isolating back-end nodes. Some nodes disconnected from the central cluster to prevent the intrusion from spreading. When I read that part, a chill ran down my spine. Not from fear, but from knowing those hackers were not prepared to face a system capable of defending itself at that level. The next emails hit my inbox like urgent knocks on a door. The internal firewall had upgraded its encryption protocol to the emergency layer I had installed only for data crisis scenarios. I had no idea what they thought they were doing by trying to unlock a system designed to resist every form of coercion. The only thing I knew for certain was that Beckham believed he was still in control. I imagined the conversation inside Nova Forge. Jordan must have seen the strange alerts and could no longer stay silent. She understood intellectual property law, and she knew the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was not something to take lightly. Attacking a protected security system registered under valid ownership was a potentially criminal act. I had presented all of that to the executive board once, and Jordan was the only person who took notes from start to finish. I knew she warned Beckham that what he was doing was not only reckless, but illegal. But Beckham never believed anything he did not want to hear. He wanted control of Sentinel-9 at any cost. In his mind, he was still the chief executive, the one with absolute authority, the person who could decide the fate of everything inside the company, even a system he had never bothered to understand. If Jordan warned him, I knew he would ignore her, or worse, assume she was undermining him. That afternoon, while I was reviewing information for my follow-up interview at Titan Systems, another alert appeared. This was no longer a medium-level warning. Sentinel-9 had placed its execution environment into high alert mode and had begun monitoring all administrative access attempts. I read the final line and knew they had gone too far. Administrative authentication failure from an untrusted source. Protection has been elevated to emergency level 3. I leaned back in my chair. In all my 8 years at Nova Forge, Sentinel-9 had never once activated that level. Not a single time. It meant the hackers had tried to unlock the deepest, most protected parts of the system. As I reviewed the entire chain of alerts, my phone rang. It was Titan Systems. Their lead technical officer wanted to schedule an additional meeting, saying they were impressed with my security philosophy and were considering offering me the leadership role for a strategic project. I listened carefully, every word clear, but in the background I could still hear the steady ping of new alerts arriving. Every sign pointed to the same truth. Nova Forge was digging itself into a deeper and deeper hole. And at the bottom of that hole was Beckham, still convinced he could break Sentinel 9 with confidence and a handful of rushed hacks. But the system did not care about his arrogance. It only cared about doing exactly what I designed it to do: protect itself and protect the truth. I thought the alerts from Sentinel 9 would be the worst thing Nova Forge had to face that week. But the market always finds a way to make things worse. On Monday morning, while I was getting ready to meet Titan Systems, an email appeared in my inbox from Liongate Solutions. Just one short subject line, but enough for me to know Nova Forge had reached its final red line: request for intellectual property verification related to Sentinel 9. I read the line again and again, then opened the attachment. Liongate was the corporation preparing to sign a massive security integration deal worth nearly $180 million with Nova Forge. They were the kind of client who never missed a single legal detail. Their internal auditors had just completed the first stage of the ownership review, and the results forced them to contact me directly. Intellectual property token, registered to the personal ownership of Ava Morgan. No transfer confirmation, no authorization for use. I exhaled slowly. What I had known all along had finally been validated by someone outside the company. For smaller businesses, this would have been nothing more than a legal inconvenience. But for Liongate, it was a strategic risk. They would never sign a major contract if there was any legal uncertainty around source code ownership. I replied with nothing but the truth. I confirmed that I was the rightful owner of Sentinel 9, that the registration was entirely legal, and that I had never granted Nova Forge any permission to use the code after being fired. I told them clearly that I had not been notified, not invited to any handoff meeting, and had not signed any transfer documents. That was enough for Liongate to reach its provisional conclusion. The contract had to be put on hold. 2 hours later, the news spread through Austin's tech circles, not because of anything I said, but because Liongate did not hide it. They were required to notify their linked partners, and in this industry, information travels like an electrical storm. By noon, I had 3 messages from former engineers and 2 calls from people I had worked with on federal projects. All of them asked the same question: what on earth was Nova Forge doing? Meanwhile, inside Nova Forge's office, Beckham was certainly shouting. I knew him. He would never face the fact that he caused the disaster. He would frame it as a personal attack, the rebellion of an employee who refused to accept change. I did not need to be there to picture him slamming his hand on the conference table, interrogating legal, blaming engineering, and then choosing the person he wanted to pin everything on: me. That afternoon, a local tech publication released an article with a headline dripping in sarcasm. An internal source claims a former engineer is sabotaging Nova Forge. I only had to read 3 lines to recognize Beckham's public relations stunt. He had hired someone to write a piece praising him while portraying me as a bitter ex-employee trying to ruin a major contract out of spite. The article even implied that I was unlawfully withholding the source code. The only thing that kept me calm was how rushed, sloppy, and painfully obvious the manipulation was. Austin's tech community is not naive. Engineers read code every day. They recognize distortion instantly. After barely a few hours, dozens of comments appeared from security experts and system architects across the industry, refuting the narrative. They did not need to know me. All they needed to see was that the company was attempting to use code with an intellectual property token registered to an individual owner. That alone told them which side had a problem. Some comments even pinpointed the exact mistakes Nova Forge was making. They analyzed the logs that Sentinel 9 had released at last year's conference and stated outright that if Beckham had truly attempted to override permissions, the fault lay not in the system, but in his lack of understanding. By evening, the dominoes began to fall. Anonymous technical advisors published threads explaining that Nova Forge might be violating federal law if it continued to force access into a system with confirmed personal ownership. Several intellectual property lawyers also weighed in, referencing previous cases with similar circumstances. I read each line feeling something quietly shift. The truth was speaking for itself, and I did not have to lift a finger. But amid that growing wave, one person could not stay calm: Nolan. Around early evening, I received a short email from him. No explanation, no apology, just one line: Ava, I think we need to talk. The sentence carried exhaustion in every word. I could feel the pressure crushing him. Nolan was trapped between two roads. On one side was Beckham, forcing him to break the system to salvage his reputation. On the other side was the truth he could no longer deny. The logs he saw every day were too clear. The alerts on his screen were not caused by me. They were caused by Nova Forge trying to open something they were never allowed to touch. I did not answer immediately, partly because I was not sure he was ready to hear what he needed to hear, partly because I knew that with Beckham's temperament, the technical and legal battle had only just begun. Outside my window, the Austin sky darkened faster than usual. The lights from the tech buildings glowed upward like a reminder that in this world, information never stays still. I stood up, poured myself a glass of water, and realized something I had never expected. I was no longer on the passive side of this story. From the moment Liongate reached out to me, the entire landscape had shifted. It was no longer me against Nova Forge. It was the market, the legal framework, and everyone who understood the situation, all turning their attention toward the truth. And Beckham, no matter how hard he tried to bury it, would never be able to smother that truth with a handful of rushed articles. 2 days after Liongate put the contract on hold, Sentinel-9 entered a state I never thought I would witness à my fancies outside of a test environment. The alerts that hit my inbox that morning carried a subject line that had never appeared once in the 8 years I spent building the system: Activation of the Intellectual Property Defense Tier 3. I sat still for a moment, not out of fear, but because I understood exactly what this meant. Tier 3 was the highest protection level, created for only two scenarios: a deliberate attack from a dangerous source, or a severe violation of intellectual property rights. Either reason meant Nova Forge had crossed every technical and legal boundary. I opened the report. The system had sealed all logs, blocking access from every administrator account. All dangerous commands, from code structure edits to ownership transfers to node overrides, were disabled. I kept reading and found the line I knew Beckham would never be able to tolerate. Sentinel-9 had sent automatic reports to the Patent Office and the Agency for Cybersecurity. The Patent Office is to report an intellectual property violation. The Cybersecurity Agency to report unauthorized access into a registered security system. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair. This was no longer a conflict between me and Beckham. Nova Forge had crossed into federal territory, and Sentinel-9, exactly as designed, had fulfilled its obligation to protect the code's rightful ownership. It did not take long for rumors to spread. Several companies in Austin reportedly received notices from federal agencies stating that Nova Forge might be involved in unlawful technological activity. Rumors like that travel fast, especially in fields tied to security. The moment investors hear the name of a federal cybersecurity agency, they grow uneasy. Inside Nova Forge, the collapse had already begun. Sentinel-9 did not merely block hostile actions. When Tier 3 activated, the system preserved all linked assets, including customer data and core operational structures. But because Nova Forge had tampered with the deepest layers, back-end nodes began isolating themselves and running only in safe mode. That led to a chain of consequences they had no ability to manage. Customer accounts are locked to prevent dangerous access. Administrative dashboards are refusing every login attempt. The payment system is unable to verify identity permissions and is automatically suspending operations. In a single day, the entire platform froze. Major clients did not wait for explanations. They pulled their contracts immediately. Nova Forge's servers were flooded with support requests, but no one could respond because the technical team had no access to the system. In that chaos, the only thing they could do was blame one another. I pictured Beckham pacing the conference room, shouting orders, firing people, reorganizing teams. He always believed he could put out fires by replacing bodies. But with a system that did not obey human command, firing people only forced Nova Forge deeper into disaster. A few people reached out to tell me he had begun removing anyone he considered incompetent. But competence was never the issue. They were fighting a machine programmed to stop the very actions Beckham insisted on forcing through. Jordan was the only one not reacting emotionally. She observed quietly, gathering every piece of information. Jordan understood that the crisis was not caused by Sentinel-9's malfunctioning. It was triggered by their violation of the code's ownership. She began collecting evidence, from emails to unauthorized access logs, to records of engineers being pressured into breaking the system. She did not confront Beckham directly, but I knew she was preparing for something bigger. When a company collapses, the person who holds the data holds the power. While Nova Forge sank deeper into turmoil, my life took a sharp turn. Titan Systems assigned me a major project to design an adaptive security system for their defense service network. The work was intense and exhilarating. They gave me a strong team, full funding, and a level of creative freedom I had never experienced at Nova Forge. Within 2 weeks, the project delivered its first breakthroughs and earned high praise from leadership. Slowly, my name began appearing in panel discussions, cybersecurity forums, and several industry publications. Not in a flashy way, but with a sense of recognition that what I built was not only strong, but ahead of its time. I received invitations to consult, to speak at conferences, and even messages from younger engineers asking about the philosophy behind Sentinel-9. I told them one thing: a good system never betrays the person who built it. That evening, I received a new message from Nolan. Unlike the short notes before, this one was long and heavy. He wrote that Nova Forge was spiraling out of control, that Beckham was forcing people to sign silence agreements, that many had stopped trusting leadership but were afraid to resist because they needed their jobs. And finally, he wrote the thing I knew he had been wanting to say. Ava, everything is falling apart layer by layer, and I think he is about to do something worse. I stared at the screen, not worried for Nova Forge, but worried for Nolan. Good people often get caught in the orbit of bad decisions. But no matter how chaotic things were becoming, I understood one truth. This collapse was not caused by Sentinel-9. It simply exposed the consequences of the choices Beckham had made. And once the truth begins to move, no one can stop it. That morning, when I checked my phone before heading to Titan Systems, 2 new messages sat at the top of my inbox. They were not the usual technical alerts I had grown familiar with from Sentinel-9. These were formal notifications from the Patent Office and the Federal Cybersecurity Agency. I opened the Patent Office document first. They requested that I verify ownership of Sentinel-9, including the intellectual property token, registration date, and evidence of its original development. They stated clearly that the system had sent an automatic report detailing severe violations coming from Nova Forge. I responded immediately. I always kept every document organized, ready, and intact. The letter from the Cybersecurity Agency was colder. They confirmed receipt of a Tier 3 alert, along with signs of unauthorized access originating from addresses outside Nova Forge's registered network. They requested a rapid response from Nova Forge and informed me that I might be contacted for technical context regarding Sentinel-9. That was the moment I knew the investigation had officially begun. Nova Forge was nowhere near prepared for a blow like this. Jordan was the first to read the federal notifications, and true to who she was, her instinct was to call an emergency meeting. The room that morning felt tight enough to snap. Jordan placed both federal documents on the table and asked Beckham to explain everything about Sentinel-9 and why the system had sent infringement alerts to outside agencies. Beckham denied everything. He planted his hands on the table as if posture alone could prove he was still in control, and immediately blamed the engineering team. He claimed they had broken protocol, acted without permission. He even insisted that Nolan and the others interpreted his instructions incorrectly and caused Sentinel-9 to react. The room fell silent. Everyone knew he was lying, but the person he was trying to blame was quieter than all of them: Nolan. When Beckham went further, accusing him directly of bypassing permissions and sabotaging the company, Nolan stood up. No one knew where he found the courage in that moment. He pulled a flash drive from his pocket, placed it in front of Jordan, and opened his laptop. Within seconds, Beckham's late-night emails appeared on the screen. Commands to bypass authentication. Commands to unlock the system by any means. commands demanding no legal notifications, commands saying he would take responsibility. Line after line displayed undeniable proof. Nolan then produced server logs showing the exact timestamps when the gray hat hackers entered the system and every forced unlock attempt that followed. The traces of unauthorized scanning tools were unmistakable. Jordan stared at the evidence for a long moment. When she finally lifted her head, her expression had changed. No anger, just the resolve of someone who understood how close the company was to falling apart. She was not there to protect Beckham. She was there to protect the company from complete destruction. That same afternoon, Jordan compiled every email, every log, every warning report, and sent a full dossier to the board. The dossier included unauthorized code deployment, evidence of hiring gray hat hackers, executive instructions to hide information from investors, and direct violations of federal intellectual property law. The board could not ignore evidence like that. At the same time, I received a call from a board member asking if I would assist with the internal investigation as an independent expert. They said they needed me to understand Sentinel-9's responses and possible risks. I understood why they came to me. But I also understood that this chaos did not belong to me. I answered calmly, I am not involved in their decisions, and I will not fix their consequences. There was a moment of silence before they thanked me and ended the call. They understood I had no reason to return and clean up the damage others had caused. Meanwhile, inside Nova Forge, the pressure grew heavier by the hour. With both the Patent Office and the Federal Cybersecurity Agency opening investigations, investors began to panic. And Jordan, with the clearest view of the entire disaster, knew that nothing that happened now was under Beckham's control. Her job was simply to ensure that the truth reached the right people at the right time. As for me, my work at Titan Systems was reaching its strongest momentum. The strategic security project I led was performing beyond expectations, and I was beginning to be invited to share insights with other technical teams. But no matter how busy I was, whenever I thought of Nova Forge, one truth stood out with perfect clarity. The truth had slipped out of Beckham's reach, and this time he had no one left to blame. The legal storm triggered by the Patent Office and the Federal Cybersecurity Agency was only the beginning. The hardest hit arrived a few days later, while Nova Forge was still trying to cling to whatever order remained in its collapsing system. One morning, as I was reviewing test results at Titan Systems, my phone buzzed. It was a forwarded email from an old colleague at Liongate. I opened it. Just 2 lines, but they pierced straight through the heart of Nova Forge. Liongate has officially ended all negotiations. Reason: severe legal risk relating to intellectual property and system security. They used the word permanent in their notice. I read it 3 times to make sure I had not misunderstood. In the tech world, Liongate is the kind of partner whose withdrawal signals a red alert to every other corporation. And exactly as I expected, within hours, the news spread through Austin. Nova Forge's valuation dropped sharply in a single trading day. First, the hesitant investors. Then the funds that had been considering backing the company. Then the clients are on the verge of signing deals. All of them froze, demanding further review. The stock did not crash in one dramatic plunge, but fell in steady, merciless increments, like a clock counting backward. No one believed in Beckham's leadership anymore. I knew the Liongate email was a verdict that Beckham could not erase, and the board knew it too. That afternoon, they summoned him to a closed meeting. Jordan attended, carrying all the evidence she had gathered. Not just emails and access logs. She prepared a full analysis of legal exposure, projected financial losses, and violations of governance ethics. Jordan understood this was no longer a matter for the engineering team. This was about the company's survival. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. I was not in the room, but employees who were seated in the outer hall later described the scene as if they were watching a courtroom hearing. Jordan opened with the chain of events that led Sentinel-9 to activate Tier 3. She did not attack him. She laid out the facts with the clarity of someone who had no option left but to tell the truth. She presented the evidence showing Beckham's orders to break through the system, his emails instructing the team to bypass legal review, the records of hiring gray hat hackers, and the server logs documenting unauthorized access and coercive override attempts. The board turned every page. Each one cut deeper. They saw clearly: intellectual property fraud, federal violations, abuse of a security system, concealment of risk from investors, severe governance misconduct. Jordan placed the final section of the report on the table, looked each board member in the eye, and stated that if the company did not act immediately, Nova Forge could face sanctions, lawsuits, and potential exclusion from key projects for years. Only after all the evidence was presented did Beckham begin to speak. And like many whose power slips from their hands, his first reaction was denial. He claimed the emails were misinterpreted. He claimed Nolan betrayed him. He claimed Jordan fabricated the accusations to seize control. And of course, he blamed me. He said I had programmed Sentinel-9 to destroy the company if I were ever removed. A board member asked calmly why. If he had done nothing wrong, there was documentation showing he had hired outside hackers. Beckham faltered, shifted the blame to the engineers. He said they contacted outside help without his permission. But when the board asked why the orders were sent from his own account, he had no answer. Another asked why he failed to disclose system risks to investors before announcing progress on the Sentinel-9 project. Beckham avoided their gaze. Witnesses said that was the moment he lost the composure he always relied on. He began arguing, ranting about conspiracies, traps, betrayal. The more he spoke, the more he revealed the panic underneath. The board looked at him with the cold understanding of people who realized they placed power in the wrong hands. In the end, they held a vote. The result was unanimous: a full removal of authority, a full demand for Beckham to step down as chief executive immediately. When the decision was read aloud, Beckham shot to his feet, slammed his hand on the table, and shouted that they had no right. He declared the company belonged to his family, that he would sue everyone, and that no one could push him out. But the board did not change course. They asked security to escort him out of the building. One employee later described the scene: Beckham screaming even as he was walked through the lobby, pointing at people and calling them traitors. But the doors finally closed behind him, cutting off his voice like a rope snapped clean in two. An entire era of chaos ended in one afternoon. As for me, when the news reached me, I simply sat quietly for a moment. Not out of joy, not out of vindication, but because everything had finally landed exactly where it was always going to land. When a system is abused, it protects itself. When the truth is twisted, it finds its way back. And when a leader hides his mistakes behind his authority, those mistakes become the very thing that buries him. After Beckham was stripped of his authority and escorted out of the building, everything around Nova Forge split into two currents. One current dragged the company deeper into a spiral of distrust, while the other opened doors for me so gently that at times I wondered if I was dreaming. Within a single week, Titan Systems sent me an offer I never imagined I would hear. They wanted to sponsor the creation of an independent lab focused on adaptive automated security systems. The project I had led at Titan had not only succeeded, but it had revealed far greater potential. They wanted me to build a place where the next generations of Sentinel-9 could be created, free from misguided executives and reckless decisions. I did not spend long deciding, partly because I wanted to continue down my own path, and partly because Titan Systems imposed no limits on creativity. They asked for only one thing: build the foundation for a new era of security technology. And so, Aurelia Security Labs was born, a name I had imagined years earlier but never believed I would one day be able to use. Aurelia was not lavish or flashy like the expensive tech offices scattered across Austin. It sat inside a smaller building, bright, open, quiet enough for any engineer to dream up something bold. Titan Systems became the first strategic partner, funding research and sending technical teams to collaborate long-term. A few days after Aurelia officially opened, the first emails from former Nova Forge engineers began to arrive. Some wrote just to check in, some asked for advice, and a few wanted to join immediately. They told me they were tired of chaos, tired of the way Beckham had treated them, tired of defending bad decisions instead of creating real value. Nolan came in person, unannounced, appearing at the lab door on a rainy afternoon. He held a stack of documents, unmarked on the outside. He looked at me with the hesitation of someone afraid he would not be welcomed. "Ava, I need a place where I can do things the right way, and I trust you. I opened the door and let him in without a single question. Nolan was one of the few at Nova Forge who tried to keep the company aligned with the truth, no matter how intense the pressure became. He had stood up when everyone else stayed silent. I knew Aurelia needed people like him. While Aurelia grew step by step, Nova Forge continued to sink. Removing Beckham was only the tip of the iceberg. They had lost a leader, lost major clients, lost investor confidence, and worst of all, lost their operational core as Sentinel-9 remained locked in Tier 3 mode. No matter how they tried to explain it, they could not deny that their violation of intellectual property had triggered a chain of events they were powerless to stop. The media began publishing articles about the collapse, using it as a case study of how bad leadership can destroy a fast-growing tech company. In cybersecurity forums, people discussed Sentinel-9 as an advanced system capable of responding precisely to abuse, though I knew that was only a fraction of what it was built to do. One quiet weekend, when Titan Systems paused meetings so I could focus on research, I decided to drive past Nova Forge's old headquarters. Not out of pride or spite. I had no bitterness left, but something in me needed to close the chapter properly. Endings are not always about cutting ties. Sometimes they are about putting things back in their rightful place. The parking lot was nearly empty. The building lights were still on, but the life inside had faded. The glass doors that once echoed with footsteps now felt as still as dust. I stepped into the lobby. The security guard looked at me but said nothing, perhaps recognizing me from years past. I walked to the reception desk. I carried only one thing, a small silver flash drive containing the full documentation showing that I was the sole legal owner of Sentinel-9. I no longer needed to prove that to anyone, but I wanted to leave it behind as a final punctuation mark. I set the flash drive on the counter with no note, no message. Everyone inside Nova Forge had already seen the truth. Nothing more needed to be said. When I walked back outside, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just clarity. Nova Forge had done all of this to itself. I did not need to underline anything. I opened my car door, sat in the driver's seat, and glanced back at the building one last time. 8 years of work, thousands of hours of code, countless nights spent testing until dawn. All of it had become a deeper lesson than any leadership course could ever teach. It was not the code that destroyed his career, it was his arrogance that triggered every consequence. I started the engine and drove toward Aurelia, toward the place where my future was beginning again. But not from nothing. I carried experience, conviction, and a freedom I had never known before. One chapter closed, a new era began.